Hello and welcome back to Open BxRx Tuesday. It's an issue that affects 10 million women and men yearly. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience severe intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Joining me for a discussion on DV and how to spot male victims of intimate partner violence is Ines Cano of Sanctuary's Clinical Department. Ines, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you as well.
Can you tell me about your organization?
Sure. So Sanctuary for Families is New York's leading service provider for survivors of domestic violence, sex trafficking, and other forms of gender violence. We aim to combat domestic violence in 3 strategies. We provide direct services, as well as community outreach and training, and systems change advocacy. Our direct services include counseling services, legal services, shelter services, and also economic empowerment services.
Now, what can a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence look like?
So a victim can look like anyone. It can look like you and me. It can happen to anyone because domestic violence does not discriminate. But women are at higher risk of experiencing domestic violence. We know that 1 in 4 women will experience DV in their lifetime compared to 1 in 7 men. So there are certain populations that may be at greater risk of harm due to barriers to accessing services. So, for example, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, immigration status, gender identity, and sexual orientation, they're all factors that can increase an individual's vulnerability to intimate partner violence.
So, as you mentioned, women typically are victims of DV, and so we tend to think of them the most as victims, but males can also be victims of this. Can you just explain what that may look like towards a man?
Sure. So men can experience the same kinds of abuse that women can, right? Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. Some of the warning signs that someone is being abused can be someone whose partner is discouraging them from speaking to friends or family members, right? Someone who is not is their partners preventing them from making their own decisions, where there's some insulting or shaming going on. Someone who's using extreme jealousy or is controlling another person's finances. Someone who's pressuring their partner to have sex or other behaviors that they're not okay with, using intimidation and destroying objects. There are many other ways, but those are some of the signs that a partner is abusing another person. Now, some of the signs that we may see someone that we know is experiencing domestic violence, or that we think we know, is someone who is perhaps afraid, right, or anxious to please their partner. Someone who may be showing some really big changes in their personality. So perhaps you have a friend who used to be very outgoing and reachable and would always call you back, and now is perhaps very socially isolated and not as easily as accessible. Perhaps someone who is taking up or increasing drug and alcohol use. You might see some changes in physical appearance and changes in work and life behavior.
Now, why do you think that as a society we have not normalized the conversation that males can also be victims of DV?
So, unfortunately, we still have some pretty deep rooted stigmas about what men should be, right? Or what masculinity looks like. We do have societal pressures specific to men as well that can really limit, their openness and talking about their feelings, and also limit some of the behaviors that we think as a society are okay for men to do. We don't like to talk about domestic violence, period. It makes us feel uncomfortable, confused, and afraid. Furthermore, if we still uphold these certain norms of what men should be like, then it creates an environment where they are less likely to talk about their feelings of sadness, anger, and fear. And when men are vulnerable or express their feelings in non-aggressive ways, or if they respond to violence in non-violent ways, as a society, we still put labels on them and we stigmatize them, and it makes other people feel uncomfortable. So this really limits the spaces that men have to openly share about their experiences with domestic violence. And as a result, they may not report their experiences of domestic violence.
Now, how do we address the issues of men not taking DV against other men seriously? Because I think a lot of that stems from um, just like patriarchy and stuff like that. So, can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So we need to create spaces where men can be vulnerable and talk about their feelings and pain and fears and not shame them for it. They're humans, just like we all are, right? They have feelings as well. So we need to normalize these feelings. We need to applaud men who choose nonviolent ways of addressing conflict instead of rewarding those that choose violence or other forms of power and control. We need to talk to our children and teens about what's okay and not okay in relationships, especially romantic relationships. So, having said that, though, we should also not lose sight of the fact that most perpetrators of domestic violence are men and most victims are women. And this is, after all, why domestic violence is considered a form of gender based violence. So, as a society, we really need to do a better job of asking ourselves, why is this still going on, right? And why is this still around and tolerated and accepted?
I love that you brought up speaking to kids and teens about this because I think sometimes people like to shy away from topics that can be a little bit sensitive towards younger audiences. How do you handle speaking to a teenager? Because I believe that a lot of teen girls sometimes may enter relationships where that can start as young as like, I don't want to give an age, but it can start really young. How do you talk to children and teenagers about that?
Thank you for that question. So, romantic relationships, dating relationships start in usually in those years, right? In adolescence. And out of all the years that I've been doing this work, not once has a client ever said, someone told me or someone talked to me about the signs of an abusive partner when I was a teenager. Not once has anyone ever said that that's happened. So that information is, we have that information, but that information is not something that is readily available or common knowledge to our teenagers. And so we need to do a better job of talking to our youth about feelings, right? And that it's normal to have feelings of anger, sadness, and fear. But that's very different compared to wanting to control and have power over another person.
Now, I want to bring up another community that I feel doesn't get talked a lot about when it comes to DV, and that's the LGBTQ. According to your website, domestic violence is perpetrated in LGBTQ relationships at the same rate it occurs in heterosexual relationships. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that and what unique challenges they face in regards to DV?
Sure. So we know that, again, like I mentioned, DV can happen to anyone, right? And so that includes individuals from the LGBTQ community. Sometimes we assume that if there's a same-sex relationship, that power and control dynamics cannot exist, and that is simply not true. In fact, some individuals from the LGBTQ community are at higher risk of experiencing domestic violence, and they face their unique challenges. So some of the challenges may be fear or danger of being outed, prior experiences of physical or psychological trauma, experiencing hate crimes or bullying in the past, a lot of concern over LGBTQ friendly resources or providers. They may not be there or they may be limited. And also, not all DV shelters may be gender inclusive, and that can lead to further homelessness for individuals from the LGBTQ community, as well as retaliation by family.
Thank you so much for sharing that because I feel like sometimes it can get a little bit lost. So I'm so happy you were able to just clarify that. Now, I think language is very important in this situation. Can someone still be accused of intimate partner violence if they are retaliating against the initial abuse?
So we find that mutual abuse is very rare because in cases of domestic violence, one partner aims to exert power and control over the other using a pattern of repeated behaviors. Committing acts of violence in self-defense is self-preservation and should not be equated as intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, our legal system does not always see it that way, as men and women are incarcerated for using self-defense as against an intimate partner. At Sanctuary, we have advocated for changing some of our laws or changing the legal system so that victims of domestic violence can have a reduced jail sentence when they are exercising their right of self-defense.
So we have about 2 minutes left. Can we just talk about, as a society, how do we aim to become better allies to all victims and survivors of domestic abuse?
We need to believe our victims, right? We need to believe the survivors. We often question and place judgment on victims' choices. We need to place responsibility on the perpetrator of abuse, not the victim. We also need to understand that DV is not a private issue. It impacts an entire community. DV impacts children, extended family members, neighbors, and first responders. It impacts all of us when we hear something on the news, right? It can impact what we think of the world and what we think of the people around us. We also need to raise awareness about the dynamics of domestic violence and know what the signs are. And last but not least, we need to support service providers that offer resources.
Ines, can you just let everyone know how they can find your organization online?
Sure. So we have a website, which is www.sanctuaryforfamilies.org. We also have a phone number that you can reach, our main phone number, which is 212-349-6009. And we are also accessible through all New York City Family Justice Centers located in all 5 boroughs. And thankfully, in New York City, we have a 24-hour DV hotline that provides DV shelter information and other resources. And that number is listed there, which is 1-800-621-HOPE. Or you can also simply dial 311 and get connected to that DV hotline number.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that information, and thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.